Inside the Giant by Ben Solomon. Thank you for taking the time to begin this story, and it is sincerely hoped that you enjoy the journey ahead. Inside the Giant is more than the story of a powerful man. It is the story of what can live beneath strength, silence, mystery, pain, love, and the longing to be truly known. Phil Taylor's life is marked by unusual beginnings, unexpected trials, and truths that refuse to stay buried. What the world sees in him is only the surface. What waits underneath is the real story. Thank you for reading, and welcome to Inside the Giant.
Chapter 1. Night at the Orphanage. The girl moved through Magnolia Bend, Georgia like a thought she did not want to finish. Midnight had settled over the town in layers, dark windows, damp porches, the smell of river mud thickening under the trees, magnolia petals beginning to sweeten into rot, crickets rasped from every ditch and yard. A dog lifted its head from beneath a pickup truck, watched her pass and went still again. Even the town's silence felt overheated. Summer in South Georgia never fully rested. It clung to walls, skin, memory, and bad decisions. The baby in her arms was too heavy, wrong in a way she would not let herself name. Sweat ran between her shoulder blades and soaked the collar of her dress. His weight dragged through her shoulders and lower back until it felt as if the bones there were being quietly unscrewed. He did not cry. That was what terrified her most. A baby was supposed to announce himself to the world. This one seemed to be listening to it, studying it, waiting. She kept her face bent low as she crossed Magnolia Street. If anybody looked through a curtain, she wanted them to see only motion. In a place like Magnolia Bend, scandal was not one event. It was a crop that kept growing, because everybody watered it. She feared being seen, yes, but she feared being understood even more. Understanding gave rumor roots. Rumor gave shame a family. The blanket around the child was patched and faded with pink roses, one of the church lady's cast-offs, soft from too many washings. It clung to him dark with sweat. His breath touched her collarbone in damp, uneven puffs. Once his hand pressed outward against the blanket, startlingly large, fingers spreading, as if testing the very world she was carrying him toward. Her steps faltered. She almost turned around then, almost chose disgrace over abandonment, almost told herself that any life lived openly would be kinder than this one secret carried to a church stoop. But almost is a cruel word. It leaves no witness except regret. St. Matthew's Orphanage sat beside the church, with its porch light burning weakly yellow into the dark. Paint peeled from the railings. The steps held the smell of old wood, candle smoke, and the day's heat trapped in the grain. She stepped into the light and became visible to herself for one unbearable second. Dress damp, hair stuck to her forehead, hands trembling under the impossible weight of the child. She lowered him onto the stoop. The boards gave a low creak under him, like the house itself registering surprise. Still he did not cry. He only blinked up toward the light with a steadiness that pierced her harder than any accusation could have. She knelt for a moment, one hand hovering over his face without touching it, as if tenderness itself had become dangerous. She wanted to tell him something, his name perhaps, or the truth of why he had to be left, or a lie gentle enough to function as blessing, but language deserted her. The night had already decided what she was. By dawn, the town would decide what he was. She had no sentence strong enough to stop either verdict. So she touched his cheek once with the back of her fingers. The skin was warmer than she expected, living, solid, unforgivably real. Then she stood and ran. Her shoes slapped the dirt path. Magnolia leaves shifted overhead. Somewhere far off, a hound barked once and gave up. The night swallowed her quickly, but not completely. She carried the knowledge of the stoop with her, like a stone under the heart. Behind her, the baby opened his eyes wider to the yellow light, and the first loneliness he would spend a lifetime trying to name. Chapter 2. The Child No One Claims. Dawn came pale over Magnolia Bend. humid and gray, the kind of morning where every sound seemed wrapped in cloth. Sister Agnes was first to hear the noise at the front stoop. It was not a full cry, more a strained, uncertain little sound, as if the child were still deciding whether the world was worth calling to. She set down the kettle she had just begun to fill and went to the door expecting a basket, a note, one more evidence of poverty disguised as divine testing. Instead, she found a bundle so large she stared before bending to lift it. "Lord preserve us," she whispered, not in surprise alone, but as petition. The boy was dense and hot against her arms. She almost lost her balance when she first gathered him up. His eyes opened at once and moved over her face with unnerving attention. He did not squall. He watched. Babies usually arrived like storms, wet, hungry, outraged, demanding the world rearrange itself around their needs. This one arrived like a question nobody had prepared to answer. The sisters gathered quickly in aprons and half-fastened habits, whispering before the kitchen had even warmed. Sister Catherine crossed herself twice. Sister Bernadette asked whether there was a note. There wasn't. Sister Agnes checked every fold of the blanket anyway, then checked again. No name, no apology, no explanation. Only a child too heavy for ordinary expectation. When the town doctor came, still smelling faintly of shaving soap and stale tobacco, he set the scale, cleared his throat, and frowned in professional disbelief. 14 pounds, he said. The number moved through the orphanage before breakfast, and through Magnolia Bend before noon. By midday, it had become less a fact than a local omen. Some women from church came by with casseroles and old baby clothes that proved useless at once. They stood in the kitchen doorway speaking low, charitable, and eager all at once. Some called the child a marvel, some called him unfortunate. A few used phrases about the Lord's mystery that meant, in truth, the discomfort of encountering a life that refused familiar categories. Out on Magnolia Street, men with coffee cups speculated about the mother as if they were discussing weather. In a small town, moral concern and entertainment often wore the same face. Sister Agnes ignored as much of it as she could. She washed the child herself in a chipped basin by the stove. Steam lifted around them. The water cooled quickly in the morning draft, but the baby only stared at the ceiling, at the spoon dropped by Sister Catherine, at the movement of steam dissolving into air. When Agnes slid one hand under the back of his head, she felt an unexpected tenderness so fierce it bordered on fear. There were children one loved because they were fragile, children one protected because they were sweet, and children one worried for because the world had already decided to misunderstand them. This boy belonged to the last kind. They named him Phil Taylor because a child could not remain no one. Names were the first shelter the sisters knew how to build. Yet even as Sister Agnes wrote it into the ledger, her pen hesitated. Phil Taylor looked serviceable on the page. It did not seem large enough for the life already pressing against it. Outside, an old man on Magnolia Street lifted a whiskey glass toward the church and sat with an expression too still to be harmless. He did not visit, he did not ask questions, but some hard glint in him suggested recognition buried beneath denial. That evening, after the gossip had gone home and the kitchen was finally quiet, Sister Agnes held the baby in the rocking chair by the stove. The orphanage settled around her in familiar creaks. Rain threatened in the distance but did not yet fall. She looked down at the child, who had been given to the world without witness, and felt a prayer rise uninvited. Not for ease, she realized. Ease was too much to ask. She prayed instead that enough love might gather around him to contradict his beginning, that if the world insisted on making him into a sign, somebody somewhere would still insist on treating him like a boy. Chapter 3. Body of a Giant, Mind of a Boy. By the time Phil was 5, the orphanage had begun quietly reorganizing itself around his size. Beds were moved, shirt seams were let out, until there was no cloth left to give. Sister Agnes cut down old curtains to make summer clothes broad enough across the chest and shoulders. The dining chairs complained when he sat. Door frames seemed to lower in spite. At night, his feet pushed past the end of the mattress so far that the cold air found them through winter socks. The other children watched him the way children always watch difference. First with curiosity, then imitation, then cruelty when adults fail to teach them better. Some admired him because he could lift what they could not, and because older boys tended to leave him alone. Others resented that adults noticed him even when the attention was worried rather than warm. He was visible in every room. Visibility made him useful and lonely in equal measure. He did not yet have language for loneliness. He knew instead the practical symptoms: the pause before someone addressed him, the way laughter shifted when he entered it, the way grown men at church picnics praised his strength, in the same tone they used for mules, tractors, or weathered fence posts. He learned early that the world often forgave oddness when oddness worked hard. Words came slowly. He understood more than he could say, and the gap between those two facts made anger bloom in him like heat lightning. When he wanted water, and the words snagged somewhere behind his teeth, shame climbed his throat. Once trying to explain why another boy had hidden his shoes, he became so frustrated that he snapped a wooden toy in half without meaning to. The crack startled him into silence. He stared at the broken pieces in his hands as if they had accused him of becoming exactly what everyone feared. Sister Agnes found him on the back steps later, shoulders rounded, lower lip bitten white. "You didn't mean to," she said. He shook his head. "Then you begin there." He looked at her baffled. Adults often wanted clean repentance. Sister Agnes wanted truth first. The orphanage yard taught hierarchy in subtler ways, too. Smaller boys could disappear into scuffles, games, and dust. Girls clustered by the wash line, whispering with a seriousness borrowed from older sisters and overheard mothers. Phil could not disappear. If a barrel needed rolling, somebody called for him. If a jammed gate needed forcing, his name came first. If a younger child fell and scraped a knee, a sister might ask him to carry the child inside because he was so careful with the little ones. Praise followed usefulness. Belonging did not always follow praise. Still, mercy existed in fragments. A freckled girl named June corrected other children when they mocked the way Phil sounded out words. An older boy traded him the better blanket during a fever and pretended not to have noticed. Sister Agnes sometimes saved him the last biscuit in winter, sliding it onto his plate without comment so gratitude would not embarrass him. Such gestures were tiny by the town's measure. To Phil, they were proof that kindness did not need fanfare to matter. At dusk, after chores, he liked to sit on the back steps with knees high and elbows draped over them, watching Magnolia Bend soften into evening. Smoke from cook fires drifted over nearby roofs. Radios sang through static. Somewhere dishes clinked in houses where people belonged to one another casually, without needing to earn every bit of tenderness. What hurt most was not merely lacking parents. It was lacking ordinary intimacy. The kind of love that fills a plate, corrects your grammar, tells you to wash your hands, asks why you're quiet, and never imagines itself heroic. Sometimes he woke angry from dreams he could not remember. The anger felt older than he was, older even than the orphanage. It frightened him because it arrived without object. He would stand over the wash basin breathing hard, fingers gripping the chipped edge, certain he had inherited something unnamed. His blood seemed to know a story his mind had not yet been told. The town noticed his size before it noticed his personhood. Men speculated aloud about how much feed he could carry by 10. Women said, with admiration sharpened by worry, that he would make somebody useful one day. Nobody said he might make himself into anything at all. That silence shaped him nearly as much as the comments did. At night he lay on the too-short bed listening to the smaller boys breathe. Their sleep sounded ordinary. His own breathing seemed heavier, as if even rest required more machinery inside him. He would press one hand to his chest and feel the slow thud there, powerful and unfamiliar. It did not feel like a child's heart. It felt like something knocking from inside a locked room. Chapter 4. Shadows of the Grandfather. The old man first appeared in late autumn, standing just beyond the orphanage fence with a hat in his hands, and rain darkening the shoulders of his coat. Phil was 7, and raking wet leaves into a pile that refused to stay gathered. He noticed the man because the man did not smile, wave, or ask one of the sisters for directions, the way passing strangers sometimes did. He watched. There was nothing remarkable in the clothes: overalls, work boots, coat with missing buttons. But his stillness had weight. Even the other children felt it. One by one their voices dulled near that part of the yard, as if some weather system had shifted pressure. The old man's eyes were pale and tired, and carried a recognition Phil could feel without understanding. Sister Agnes came down the steps and tightened visibly when she saw him. She crossed the yard with her hands folded, not out of calm, but discipline. Their conversation stayed low, but Phil saw enough to know politeness was only a thin covering. The old man shrugged once in a way that looked practiced, the gesture of somebody long accustomed to living beside other people's accusations. Sister Agnes kept her chin high. When she returned, her mouth was set into the hard line she wore when struggling not to let anger outrun Christian duty. "Who is that?" Phil asked. "No one you need to trouble yourself over." But trouble had already entered him. The sight of the old man left a heat in Phil's chest, so immediate it frightened him. This was not the ordinary anger of embarrassment or childish frustration. It felt inherited, borrowed, as if seeing that face had lit a fuse laid in him long before he knew what a fuse was. The man came again over the months that followed, sometimes from the road, sometimes from a truck parked half a block away. Once he stood smoking under a chinaberry tree, hat tilted back, studying the yard as if looking for an item misplaced years earlier. Magnolia Bend specialized in partial knowledge. Everybody knew something about everybody else, but not enough to interrupt routine until tragedy forced explanation. Phil sensed at once that the old man belonged to one of those locked chambers of town memory. Shopkeepers nodded to him with too much brevity. Women lowered their voices when he passed. No child heard his name spoken openly. The pattern itself taught Phil something important. Silence is often the first architecture of inherited harm. One evening, the old man tipped his hat toward Phil with a private, almost mocking courtesy. Phil felt rage flash through him so hard his vision whitened at the edges. Later that night, he snapped the leg off a chair while carrying it and stared at the broken wood in stunned horror. Sister Agnes found him in the laundry room afterward, shoulders shaking. "It don't feel like mine," he said. She knew what he meant. Not the chair, the rage. "Some families pass down land," she told him after a long silence. "Some pass down debt, some pass down silence." She did not yet tell him which kind of inheritance he had been left, because she believed then that withholding truth might protect a child. In later years, she would question that belief more than once. Phil began studying his own reflection in window glass after that. In certain lights his brow looked too severe. His jaw, when he clenched it, resembled somebody he feared he already knew. He wondered whether blood was a road a person had to follow, or only a map other people used to trap him. Outside the fence, the old man kept appearing with the patience of gathering weather. Inside the orphanage, Phil grew taller, stronger, and more wary of what might be waiting inside him to be named. Chapter 5. Discovering the Field. The football field behind Magnolia Bend High was little more than a broad patch of stubborn earth, with chalk lines that never stayed crisp, and goalposts that leaned as if burdened by history. Weeds crept near the sidelines. The bleachers rattled in wind. The grass grew patchy over hard red clay. To anybody else it looked worn out. To Phil, the first afternoon he stepped onto it, it felt like the first place built to make sense of him. Coach Mercer had noticed him carrying crates behind the grocers and watched the way the large boy moved, less lumbering than efficient, all balance where there should have been awkwardness. Mercer had coached long enough to know that bodies sometimes arrived carrying gifts before the mind understood what the gifts were for. "You ever played?" he asked. Phil shook his head. You want to? The question landed with unexpected force. People usually asked what he could lift, not what he wanted. Practice began in confusion. How to stand, where to place hands, how low to keep his pad level, when to drive through, and when to contain. Yet the language of football entered him quickly, because it moved through the body before it ever demanded fluency from the tongue. Run here, turn there, hit that sled, keep your feet under you, use your hands. The instructions were simple, exact, and merciful in their clarity. For the first time in his life, his size felt less like a problem to be managed and more like an instrument tuned to purpose. When he ran, the ground seemed to answer him. When he struck a tackling dummy and drove it backward, something locked into place inside his chest. Force, under rules, became almost peaceful. Coach Mercer praised effort, not novelty, and that changed Phil more than he knew at first. Good work today, Mercer said after one sweaty practice, laying a firm hand on his shoulder pads. The word stayed in Phil's body long after the touch was gone. Praise tied to labor rather than spectacle felt cleaner. It suggested he could shape what had once only happened to him. The other boys took time to adjust. At first they stared, joked, tested him. Then they began including him in the rough democracy of football. Curses after missed assignments, laughter in drills, shoulder slaps after big stops. On the field, hierarchy came with rules. Rules were mercy. Even bruises felt different there. They belonged to action chosen in pursuit of something, not simply to clumsiness, in a world built too small. Practice also became a grammar for emotions he had never learned to articulate. Shame could be burned through repetition. Fear could be outrun for 40 yards. Anger could be driven into a blocking sled until it returned as technique. In a life where feeling had often arrived as confusion, football offered translation. After practice, when the sun slanted low and gnats gathered over the grass, Phil would sometimes remain at midfield alone. Empty bleachers clicked as they cooled. The smell of sweat, dirt, and cut weeds lingered in the air. He would stand looking at the silent stands and feel, for a moment, proportionate to the world around him. Not too large, not unfinished, correct. One evening Sister Agnes came to fetch him and found him staring across the field with his helmet in hand. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He took his time answering. "When I run here," he said, "it don't feel like they're looking at me wrong." She nodded because she understood the holiness of that better than any sermon. Every soul needs a place where it is not first explained before it is accepted. Autumn gathered quickly after that. Friday night swelled in importance. Magnolia Bend began pinning little hopes onto the broad shoulders of the orphan boy, who moved like impact had finally found a worthy instrument. Phil did not yet understand what that would cost. He only knew the field had given him an answer to loneliness that felt, at least for now, like grace. Chapter 6. Phil the Grill. The nickname was born under lights, noise, and adolescent bloodlust, the usual conditions under which towns decide to make folklore out of children. Magnolia Bend was playing a rival school from a county with cleaner uniforms and fathers who spoke a little too loudly about discipline and breeding. By halftime, the game had turned sharp-edged. Late whistles, hidden elbows, hands snagging face masks in the pile. The crowd loved what it pretended not to love. In the third quarter, a running back broke through the line with his knees high and the ball clutched tight. Phil met him clean and hard. The sound of impact cracked through the stadium like split wood. The boy's body flew sideways. The ball came loose. For a heartbeat there was silence, not from concern but astonishment. Then the stands exploded. Someone from the student section screamed, "Phil the Grill," and the phrase spread instantly, catching first in laughter, then delight, then full chant. By the next play, it was rolling through the bleachers in waves. Boys stomped it. Girls shrieked it. Men repeated it with the satisfied relish, reserved for names that make violence sound charming. Inside the helmet, Phil heard it all, as if underwater. Teammates swarmed him at the sideline, slapping his pads, laughing. Coach Mercer grinned in spite of himself. A local reporter scribbled into a notebook with sudden excitement. In Magnolia Bend, a nickname was never only a joke, it was a claim, a way of taking a person and converting him into common property. By Monday, the name had reached the diner, the feed store, the barber shop, and the church parking lot. The local paper printed it beneath a grainy action photo, catching Phil mid-collision, all shoulders in force. Seeing himself frozen in newsprint unsettled him. The image looked conclusive in a way his inner life never did. That night after the game, he stood in the locker room mirror with steam lifting from the showers and his helmet tucked under one arm. Without the face mask, he looked younger than the nickname allowed. His eyes carried uncertainty the paper could not photograph. Phil the Grill sounded like a thing built for public appetite. Phil, the boy inside the nickname, felt more complicated and less secure than ever. At the orphanage, some of the younger boys repeated the chant with worshipful excitement. Others used it with the brittle edge children borrow, when they envy what they cannot replicate. Sister Agnes only asked whether he liked it. He could not answer immediately, and the delay troubled him. Part of him did like it. There was no point lying. The chant gave him status, force, and temporary invulnerability. Yet another part recoiled from how quickly the crowd had learned to celebrate the most frightening element of him, while ignoring the rest. He had waited all his life to be seen. Instead, he was becoming legible in the wrong language. Late that night, he lay awake listening to insects at the screen window and replayed the hit. He had loved the clarity of it, the perfect body logic of strike and consequence. That frightened him too. He was beginning to understand that the world's praise could attach itself to the very parts of him he most feared leaving undefined. A legend had begun to form around him. Legends are flattering because they simplify. Phil was not yet wise enough to resist simplification, but he had already begun to feel its theft. Chapter 7. Under the Lights. Friday nights in Magnolia Bend became their own weather. Pickup trucks lined the roads near the stadium. Women in pressed blouses carried casseroles to the concession stand. Boys chased one another under the bleachers with paper cups of cola. The marching band's notes floated half-sharp and joyous into the dusk. By sundown, the field seemed cut away from ordinary life and lit from another world. Phil came to love the hour before kickoff almost more than the game itself. The team waited beneath the bleachers where the boards trembled under stomping feet above. Sweat, cut grass, popcorn grease, metal, and anticipation fused into one hot smell. Shoulder pads pressed tight, helmets knocked lightly against cinder block walls. His own breath sounded louder once the chin strap snapped in place. The helmet narrowed the world. That was part of its mercy. Vision reduced to bars and openings. Noise changed shape. The face disappeared. On the field, he could become function, reaction, impact. In a life increasingly crowded by people's assumptions, that reduction felt almost restful. Once the game began, time stopped behaving like time. Plays came in sharp bursts of total attention, followed by floating instants where he could hear moths sizzle against the lights, and the crowd inhale as one body. He felt the field beneath his cleats, the exact give of dirt, the pressure of another player's hands on his jersey, the hot sting when grass scraped exposed skin. Under the lights, his body did not feel excessive. It felt legible. But the stadium created its own dangerous kind of love. People in town borrowed confidence from the game. Men who spent weekdays losing arguments to debt, weather, and bosses shouted like emperors on Friday nights. Women who stretched groceries for children sang the school song with fierce delight. Magnolia Bend believed in itself more fully during football than in any church sermon or election season. Phil felt honored by that faith, and trapped by it too. It is hard to separate devotion from dependency when both arrive cheering. Girls began calling his name in hallways at school. Teachers smiled at him more readily. Boys who once tested him now sought his approval with awkward jokes and borrowed swagger. Even preachers nodded toward his future from the pulpit, in tones that suggested sport might be adjacent to redemption. After one especially loud victory, when rappers rolled across the stands in the cooling wind and the last cheers were fading into truck engines, Coach Mercer found him sitting alone on the bench. "You ought to be celebrating," Mercer said. Phil kept looking at the field. "Feels quiet after." Mercer lowered himself beside him, knees popping. "Noise lies," he said after a while. "Quiet tells the bill." Phil carried that sentence for years. Because quiet did tell the bill. Quiet asked what was left once the lights shut down one bank at a time, and darkness reclaimed the yard. Quiet asked what part of the person remained once the roll ended. It was in quiet that Phil felt the first pressure of a larger fear, that he might become dependent on being performed, because ordinary life did not yet know what to do with him. As the season deepened, he understood more clearly that the field was both refuge and trap. It gave him belonging, purpose, and admiration. It also taught him how intoxicating it could be to be seen for only one useful portion of himself. When he walked home under the stars after games, still smelling of sweat and grass and the inside of the helmet, he carried both kinds of knowledge at once. Chapter 8. The Weight of Their Cheers. By senior year, Phil no longer belonged entirely to himself. He belonged to Magnolia Bend on Fridays, to rumor on Saturdays, to college letters on Mondays, and to expectation every hour between. Adults who had never asked what he feared or wanted spoke with certainty about his future. They said scholarship, opportunity, escape. They said NFL the way church women said salvation. The difference, Phil noticed, was that football plans involved his body more than his soul. The cheers were not abstract. They had physical weight. He felt them in the grip of local businessmen who shook his hand too hard, in the bright ambition of teachers who suddenly discussed him as proof that the school could produce, in the reverent way younger boys watched him tie his cleats. Admiration can become pressure when it arrives carrying an entire town's hunger. Letters from colleges arrived thick with brochures, showing brick buildings, green lawns, boys grinning in Letterman jackets, futures that looked smoother than anything Phil had known. He spread them across the orphanage table and studied them as if they belonged to someone more practiced in possibility. The paper smelled faintly chemical and expensive. Sister Agnes touched one glossy photograph with a finger and murmured, almost to herself, "A life can widen if a place lets it." Phil wondered whether places ever truly widened for people like him, or whether they simply offered larger stages on which to be misunderstood. He wanted to want everything everybody wanted for him. Some of that desire was real. He liked the game. He liked the precision of it, the honest physicality, the way rules gave violence shape. He liked that football had altered how Magnolia Bend looked at him, even if only partly. But beneath those satisfactions lived a quieter longing he could barely admit. He wanted to be valued not only for conquering space, but for becoming a person within it. One Sunday after church, he walked alone through town with his tie loosened and dress shoes gathering red dust. A group of boys pedaled by on bicycles, shouting, "Fill the grill!" with delight. He raised a hand and smiled because that was the expected response. Then he passed a hardware store window and caught his reflection in it. Broad shoulders, serious face, eyes older than his age. He looked, suddenly, like someone already being converted into memory before he had learned how to live in the present. That evening, Sister Agnes found him at the kitchen table with a scholarship letter unopened in front of him. "What frightens you?" she asked. He stared at the envelope. All of it, and not getting none of it, both. She did not laugh. She understood paradox too well for that. "That's usually how calling feels before it becomes a life," she said. Phil was not sure football was a calling. Some days it felt more like the loudest room available to a boy who had never been given quieter ways to matter. Yet he could not deny that the game had brought him dignity, money in sight, and options beyond Magnolia Bend. The problem was not opportunity itself. The problem was how easily opportunity and ownership can begin to resemble one another when a community talks about your future as if it already belongs to them. Every cheer, Phil was beginning to understand, contained a hidden instruction. Stay the shape we praise. Do not outgrow the story we are using you to tell. And that instruction, though spoken as love, weighed more heavily than most people realized. Chapter 9. Drafted Again. The letter from the government arrived on a rain-heavy afternoon when Magnolia Bend looked made of tin, wet clay, and old resignation. Sister Catherine called Phil to the front hall while rain stitched gray lines down the window glass. The envelope was crisp, official, and cold before he even touched it. Official things often felt that way to him, less like communication than decision. He opened it by the window and read the language of duty, reporting dates, and service to country. The words were clean enough to be bloodless, yet beneath them he heard one harsher truth. Again, drafted first by the town into symbolic usefulness, by football into collective longing, by his body into spectacle, now drafted by the nation into war. Sister Agnes read the letter when he handed it to her. Her face did not crumple. She had lived too long to pretend the state asked permission from boys like Phil. "Will you go?" she asked quietly. He gave a humorless laugh. "Feels like they already decided." News moved through Magnolia Bend with its usual hungry speed. Men shook his hand with solemn pride. Some said the army would make a man of him, as if manhood were not already waiting impatiently in his bones. Women told him to keep his faith. Former classmates spoke with the embarrassing excitement of people who confuse danger with glory when it belongs to somebody else's life. Only Coach Mercer looked sick. "They won't cheer out there," Mercer said when he came to say goodbye. "Remember that. No crowd, no song, just the bill for all the talk folks like to do." The sentence stripped the patriotic varnish off every speech that followed. The night before he boarded the bus, Phil walked through Magnolia Bend alone. The barbershop windows were dark. The river smell rose thick beyond the trees. He passed the church, then the football field, and stopped with both hands hooked in the fence. Moonlight silvered the empty grass. He stood there a long time wondering how many stages a life could cross before any of them felt chosen from inside. Orphanage, stadium, army. He began to suspect adulthood might simply be the long act of answering for destinations set in motion by other people's decisions. Later, he sat on the orphanage steps with Sister Agnes while frogs called from the ditch and water dripped from the roof after the rain. "I don't know what kind of man comes back," he said. "No one does," she answered. "The only mercy is that you don't owe them the version they send away." He held that sentence closed the next morning when the bus hissed at the curb and Magnolia Bend gathered to perform farewell. Mothers cried, men nodded, children waved without understanding what they were waving at. Phil climbed aboard carrying a duffel, a body too useful to be left alone, and the dim knowledge that the world kept finding new uniforms in which to demand his surrender. As the town receded behind rain-streaked glass, he felt fear, anger, and obedience settle uneasily beside one another. None of them canceled the others. Together they formed the beginning of the man war would test. Chapter 10. Training the Giant. Army training reduced men to appetite, fatigue, and motion. Wake before dawn. Dress in the half-dark. Run. Obey. Eat fast. Repeat. The days came stripped of ornament, until time itself seemed to march in boots. For some men, the routine was dehumanizing. For Phil, it also contained a dangerous relief. The body knew what to do. Thought could be postponed. He stood out immediately. There was no avoiding that. Drill sergeants took one look at him and recalculated. Some saw asset before person. Others seemed offended by the amount of physical space he occupied and tried to grind him down harder for it. Institutions, he learned quickly, love unusual bodies most when they can be turned into function. The barracks smelled of wool, soap, leather, metal polish, and restless sleep. At night, men wrote letters home or pretended not to be homesick. Some boasted loudly to cover fear. Others went quiet in the way of people conserving themselves against the unknown. Phil drifted toward silence by instinct, but the army had a way of assigning company anyway. A wiry recruit from Louisiana named Terrence attached himself to Phil with the shamelessness of the lonely. Terrence talked when nervous, and was therefore almost always talking. Catfish, cousins, girls, bad landlords, baiter ideas. Phil found him exhausting and comforting in equal measure. In a place built to strip individuality into sameness, Terrence insisted on sounding like himself. "You know what your problem is?" Terrence said one evening while shining boots. Phil glanced over. "Got many. You make folks think you ain't got an inside. Big men do that. People assume all the room went to muscle." Phil laughed, surprised by the truth of it. There were humiliations in training too, the kind institutions call discipline, and men recognize as ritualized control. Being screamed at by men half his size awoke the old heat in him, the same heat he'd felt at the orphanage fence, in school corridors, under other people's ignorance. But now he learned to bank it, to let rage burn down into compliance rather than explosion. That frightened him nearly as much as open fury once had. He was learning not just endurance, but efficient self-erasure. Yet the body sharpened under the regime. He ran faster, learned angles of force, learned how to move weight without wasting motion, learned how repetition could train fear into reflex. Instructors praised him in the tone mechanics use for durable machines. The praise was useful. It was also familiar in the worst way. All his life, systems had thanked him most readily when he ceased asking what his strength was for. In the rare early morning moments before the whole barracks woke, he would catch the smell of wet earth after a drill field shower and think of Magnolia Bend after rain. Those flashes of home came not as comfort, but as proof that another life existed outside command. Sister Agnes mending shirts by lamplight, Coach Mercer leaning on the fence, the field at dusk. These memories became small contraband forms of selfhood. When deployment orders finally came, Phil felt no cinematic rush of patriotism, only a tightening. Training had made him stronger, quicker, more obedient than he had intended to become. It had honed him into an answer. The only question left was what the jungle would ask. Chapter 11. Jungle of Mirrors. Vietnam struck him first through the senses, heat that did not lift, air thick enough to feel chewed before swallowed, rot, mildew, wet canvas, fuel, smoke, gun oil, bug spray, and human fear combined into a smell that never truly left the skin. Magnolia Bend had humidity. This was possession. The jungle did not behave like landscape. It behaved like consciousness, dense, suspicious, alive with what could not be fully seen. Every path looked temporary. Every silence felt negotiable. Water stood where land should have been, and the ground itself seemed undecided under a man's boots. Trees rose from mud like witnesses refusing testimony. Rain there did not feel like rain at home. In Georgia, rain belonged to porches, tin roofs, red dirt, and the promise of cooler night air after. Here it seemed to rise from the ground as much as fall from the sky. It turned uniforms clammy, rifles slick, tempers brittle. Sleep never felt clean. Waking never felt complete. The men adapted in the only ways available. Terrence kept joking, though now the jokes came shorter, edged with nerves. Others smoked when they could, cursed when they couldn't, and watched tree lines as if foliage itself had moral intention. Phil spoke little, his attention turned inward and outward at once, cataloging danger while old memories surfaced in strange flashes. Church varnish, peach skin, wool blankets at the orphanage, the sound of moths at stadium lights. In war, memory does not arrive in sequence. It arrives by scent, pressure, and body logic. One day, while crossing a flooded stretch of earth, Phil caught his reflection in dark standing water. Helmet, mud, jaw hard, eyes flat with vigilance. For one brief sickening instant, he saw the old man from Magnolia Bend in himself with terrifying clarity. Not because war had made him that man, but because circumstance had revealed how much unused sharpness already lived in him. That knowledge frightened him more than enemy fire in some ways. Violence from outside can be opposed. Violence discovered as possibility within the self requires a different courage. At night, while artillery muttered in the distance and insects tested every inch of exposed skin, Phil lay awake, listening to men talk in their sleep. The jungle became a mirror, not because it reflected appearances, but because it stripped excuse. Back home, a man could blame pressure, poverty, misunderstanding, fate. Here, under enough fear, every person met whatever lived closest to instinct. Phil met a guardian and a weapon occupying the same body. The discovery did not simplify him, it deepened the split. He could protect his platoon with terrifying efficiency. He could also feel, afterward, the cold nausea of recognizing how little time morality gets to speak when survival takes command. In the morning's patrol resumed. Mud sucked at boots, vines snagged gear, sweat pooled at the waistband before sunrise. Somewhere beyond the next bend might be silence, or ambush, or a day that looked ordinary until it split open. The jungle reflected all of it back at him. The fear, the endurance, the old anger, the discipline, the loneliness of being built for tasks that leave the soul behind trying to catch up. Chapter 12. Saving the Platoon. The ambush happened in 1 second and in every second afterward. One moment the platoon was moving in strained caution through a narrow corridor of brush, all senses tuned and frayed. The next came the crack of gunfire, then shouting, then the impossible multiplication of direction. Dirt jumped. Leaves burst into green fragments. A man behind Phil screamed something cut short too fast to understand. Training took the first decisions before thought could interfere. Phil turned toward the fire, not away from it. A soldier to his left went down clutching his neck. Terrence vanished behind smoke and brush, still yelling. The world collapsed into tasks. Identify, move, drag, fire, survive, repeat. There are moments in violence when the body becomes its own terrible theology. Every lesson condenses into instinct. Every instinct asks for cost later. Phil charged because the line was folding, because men were trapped, because all his life people had expected force from him, and now force was the only language available between his platoon and slaughter. He tore through brush, fired, hauled one wounded man backward by his harness, turned, fired again, felt rounds crack through leaves close enough to seem personal. Time lost sequence. What remained was pressure and command. Later men would call what he did heroic. In the moment it felt mechanical and intimate all at once. He remembered a body slamming against his blood slick on his forearms, the smell of hot metal and ruptured earth, the astonishing lightness of a wounded boy he dragged into cover, the shock of discovering how close protecting life can stand to taking it. Terrence reappeared with one hand pressed to a wound, and dirt streaked across his teeth, still trying to joke because joking was the last form of courage he knew. Somewhere nearby, a dying soldier called for his mother, not dramatically, just reflexively, as though language itself defaults to origin under enough pain. Mud sucked at Phil's boots with every movement, as if the earth wanted a share of the dead. At some point the firing slackened, then stopped. The silence afterward was not peace. It was accounting. Phil sat in the mud with his hands hanging between his knees and shook so hard his teeth clicked. Terrence crouched beside him, unusually quiet. Medics moved among bodies with the desperate competence of men, pretending there was still time. Smoke drifted in sour ribbons through the trees. Phil looked at his own hands and felt innocence depart in a measurable way, not because he had chosen cruelty, but because he had discovered how capable he was under conditions that rewarded speed over reflection. The world would call him brave. He felt only divided. Officers praised him before the dead had been fully counted. Paperwork started, citations were mentioned. None of it touched the truth of the scene. Memory, unlike ceremony, had no obligation to flatter him. It kept the details the medal would not mention. That night he scrubbed blood from beneath his nails and watched the basin water darken, clear, then darken again. The water changed faster than memory. He understood then that saving lives had not merely made him visible, it had made him lonelier. The giant had done what the moment demanded. The man inside him would spend years asking at what cost. Chapter 13. Hero's Silence. The metal came polished and heavy, pinned to his chest by careful hands in a place far removed from mud, rot, and the sounds men make when the body begins leaving them. Officers spoke in clean words: valor, devotion, uncommon courage. Phil stood where he was placed and felt, with growing unreality, that the event described some other war, perhaps some other man. Men congratulated him with the strained admiration reserved for those whose survival others need to regard as meaningful. Some were sincere. Some needed his heroism to make the war feel legible. Phil accepted all of it, because refusal would have required a language he still did not possess. The trouble with surviving violence is that the world rewards the visible act and ignores the invisible remainder. No medal accounted for waking with jaw clenched and palms damp. No citation acknowledged the way harmless sounds, a tray dropped, a door slammed, a car backfiring, could make his body search for cover before his mind caught up. Back in civilian clothes, supermarkets, bus stations, and church foyers sometimes felt more disorienting than patrol. People expected him to re-enter ordinary manners without transition. Say thank you, accept the handshake, smile for the photograph. Yet some primitive portion of him remained tuned to danger, scanning hands, counting exits, bracing at sudden movement. He carried war into harmless spaces the way burrs cling to wool, small, persistent, and maddening to remove. Terrence visited him once after the ceremony and put a pack of cigarettes on the table between them. "You ever gonna tell folks what happened out there?" he asked. Phil looked at the metal case. They already decided. Terrence nodded. "Yeah, they do that." When Phil finally returned to Magnolia Bend, he carried the medal in his duffel as though it were contraband. He did not exactly hate it. He hated what it invited. It invited simplification. It turned the worst day of his life into public proof of noble character, fit for speeches and newspaper columns. It gave other people a place to set their emotions, so they would not have to ask what a man loses while becoming useful under fire. Homecoming awaited him with flags and band music and proud faces. He knew already the town would receive the hero version first. The silence inside him would have to stand in the doorway and wait its turn. As the plane descended and the land beneath the window became familiar again, he realized silence had changed. As a child, it had been lonely. As a soldier, it had become crowded, with the dead, the unasked questions, and the terrible knowledge that the capacity for violence could coexist with love and duty in the same chest. That was the silence the metal could not touch. That was the silence he brought home. Chapter 14. The Homecoming That Changed Everything. Magnolia Bend welcomed him back like returning weather. Bunting hung from storefronts. School children waved handmade flags. The band played too loud and half a beat off, which somehow made the performance feel truer than polish would have. Men in pressed shirts shook his hand. Women cried before they even reached him. The town had sent away its giant and wanted back a legend sturdy enough to reassure them. Phil rode through the streets in the back of a convertible, smiling when required, lifting his hand on cue. The summer air smelled of hot pavement, barbecue smoke, cut grass, and the river beyond town. Faces blurred into one collective need: Prove to us that sacrifice returns noble. Prove to us the boy we sent away came back understandable. He played the part as well as he could, but the applause struck him like weather against a shell. Homecoming did not erase war, it staged it. Then he saw her. She stood near the church fence just beyond the thickest cluster of townspeople, a woman no longer young, dressed simply, carrying herself with the tense restraint of someone bracing for impact. Her hands worried the strap of her purse until the leather twisted. When her eyes met his, something passed through him so quickly and strangely that for a second he forgot where he was. Recognition was impossible, yet his body knew before his mind did that she belonged to the unanswered part of his life. She approached only when the mayor turned to greet another veteran. Up close he saw grief in the face before he saw beauty or age. Not fresh grief, older, baked in, organized around long denial. "I'm proud of you," she said, and the words sounded as though they had traveled a great distance to reach him. "Do I know you?" he asked. A tiny flinch crossed her face. "No," she said too quickly. Then softer, "Not really." Somebody called his name from the stage. Her fingers touched his sleeve just once. The gesture was light, almost reverent, but it sent a strange current through him. Hunger, pity, anger, familiarity, all without explanation. She stepped back, as though she had touched something hot. "Take care of yourself," she said. Then she was gone, absorbed into the moving crowd before he could ask anything that mattered. That night he stood before the mirror at the orphanage, loosening his tie and replaying her face with obsessive precision. The tremor at the corner of her mouth, the way pride and grief occupied her body at once, the hesitation before contact. He had been looked at by coaches, soldiers, journalists, fans, and lovers. None had looked at him that way, with such mingled hunger and remorse. He searched for her in the following days among church gatherings, grocery aisles, porches, and parade photographs. Nothing. Yet her absence became presence of another kind, a pull toward origin, painful because it arrived without language. The town moved on quickly to baseball scores, church suppers, and local gossip. Phil did not. Somewhere in Magnolia Bend was a woman who had touched his sleeve like apology. The applause of homecoming faded. That single gesture did not. Chapter 15. The Summer That Named Him. Josie Randolph entered his life carrying a paper sack of peaches and an expression suggesting she had no interest in folklore. It was late July, heat hanging over the fields in visible waves, and Phil had come out to repair fence posts on a piece of land outside town. Josie lived next door in a white clapboard house with chipped steps, a hand pump near the kitchen, and a little boy who watched the world as though it owed him something entertaining by noon. The first thing she said to Phil was, "Big man like you ought to know better than to lean all that on old wood." He looked down and saw he had cracked the fence post while steadying himself. He laughed. She laughed too, not because he was impressive, but because the moment was. Something in him loosened. Being treated as a person before a symbol was still rare enough to feel medicinal. Josie was a widow in the practical sense. No time for decorative sadness, no patience for nonsense. A mind always measuring what could stretch and what had already broken. Yet there was softness in her too, not innocence, but tenderness, disciplined by survival. She could tease with one sentence and make coffee for the whole road on the next. Their first long conversation happened on her porch after dark. Frogs sang from the ditch, fireflies drifted low over the weeds. The peaches she sliced smelled lush and floral in the heat. Marcus had fallen asleep inside with one shoe still on. Josie sat with one leg tucked beneath her and studied Phil over the rim of a mason jar. "Town loves you," she said. "Town loves what I do," he answered. "And you?" He was quiet too long, and she let the silence stand. That was one of her gifts. She did not rush to fill spaces where a man was trying to tell the truth. What deepened things between them was not only desire, though desire moved between them with undeniable heat. It was the way Josie let him be clumsy without shaming him. He did not know polished language. He did not know how men were supposed to flirt except by being more confident than he felt. Josie found his awkward honesty funny and sweet. Under her teasing, he learned that intimacy could contain laughter instead of only solemn need. Marcus complicated the tenderness in the best possible way. The boy trusted Phil immediately and practically. He wanted piggyback rides, stories, help with a broken slingshot, somebody to witness a frog under the pump. Phil discovered that children drew softness out of him faster than adults ever had. When Marcus fell one afternoon and split his lip, he ran not first to his mother but to Phil, who knelt in the dust and talked low until the crying eased. Josie watched from the porch, and for one brief moment seemed to see a future she had no business naming. Their affair arrived through habit more than declaration. A cup of coffee became supper. Supper became another hour on the porch. A hand lingered where it once would have withdrawn. The first night he stayed late enough for the crickets to seem louder than thought. Josie kissed him with the confidence of a woman old enough to know tenderness and hunger need not be enemies. With her, his body changed meaning. All his life it had been labor, force, spectacle, defense. Under Marcus's weight, as the boy fell asleep against his shoulder, under Josie's hand laid flat against his chest, while they sat in the dark, it became shelter. "You're kinder than folks know," she told him once. He answered before caution returned, "Maybe kinder than I know." That summer named him in ways the stadium never had. Not with a chant, with intimacy, with a child climbing his back, with a woman who saw the man inside the frame and was not afraid of the room he took up there.
Chapter 16. From Jungle to Stadium. The transition from veteran to professional athlete happened with suspicious speed, as if one system had simply handed him to another better-dressed one. Scouts reappeared. Contracts were mentioned. Men in suits spoke about upside, marketability, discipline, and second chances. Magnolia Bend heard the numbers before Phil did and congratulated him for choices he had not yet made. Signing the contract felt less triumphant than administrative. Papers slid across a polished desk, pens clicked, air conditioning hummed. An agent explained percentages and endorsements in a tone meant to sound empowering. Phil thought absurdly of muddy boots, Josie's porch, the smell of peaches turning sweet in the dark. The room wanted excitement. He felt mostly displacement. Professional football introduced him to a new class language. Owners spoke in Finnish certainties. Agents talked equity, image, leverage. City reporters treated human movement like investment. Money solved many concrete problems quickly. It also created subtler distortions. Some people deferred too easily. Others assumed access they had not earned. Phil learned fast enough, but wariness stayed close. Training camp was colder and more polished than any field he'd known. Men arrived with expensive luggage, practice swagger, and fathers who understood contract law. Some had been groomed for this life from childhood. Phil had been raised around patched clothes and borrowed futures. The league felt sleek, strategic, and ravenous. Yet when he stepped onto the professional field, some familiar alignment returned. The game remained, beneath all commerce, a patterned violence he understood. He learned the playbook, studied film, strengthened his body beyond what he had once thought possible. The structure helped, so did the paycheck. But every new success also widened the distance between the life he inhabited publicly and the small Georgia spaces where he still felt most real. Josie became that hidden measure of reality. He called from hotel rooms, smelling of detergent and stale air conditioning. He listened to Marcus report on schoolyard battles, frogs, and scraped knees. Whenever he returned south, her kitchen, with onion smell in the curtains, the chipped enamel basin, the thin hum of a fan, felt more honest than any apartment leased in his name. "You look tired in richer clothes," Josie told him once. He laughed, then fell quiet because she had placed a finger on the exact bruise. The NFL gave him status, money, and a larger stage. It also began teaching him how fame can travel faster than self-understanding. Stadiums grew, crowds swelled, cameras lingered, yet some part of him remained on a porch in Georgia with a woman who refused to worship him, and a boy who asked for stories instead of signatures. That contrast kept him from floating entirely free of himself. He would need that ballast more than he knew. Chapter 17. National Myth. In the NFL, local legend became national consumption. Sports writers loved opposites, and Phil offered them a whole buffet. Giant frame, quiet manner, devastating hits, shy interviews. War hero turned football spectacle. They wrote him as if America itself had designed him to symbolize strength, endurance, and humble masculinity. The country loves a myth most when it can pretend the myth has no cost. Celebrity, Phil learned, is a collaboration between strangers. The famous provide image and incident. The public supplies longing, fantasy, fear, and projection. Every city he entered seemed to already know what version of him it wanted. Interviewers wanted resilience. Sponsors wanted likability. Fans wanted access to greatness diluted enough to feel personal. Very few people wanted the full burden of another human being's contradictions. The league taught him performance beyond the field. Smile here, sign that, answer this question without actually answering it. Publicists suggested he open up more, while also warning him not to be too complicated. He learned to occupy the outer layer of himself with skill. It was not dishonesty, exactly, more like strategic reduction. At night in hotel rooms after nationally televised games, he watched highlight reels in the blue light of the television with ice wrapped around his knees. Slow-motion replay turned violence into choreography. Announcers praised instinct, aggression, dominance. The body on the screen looked mythic. The man on the bed felt exhausted, bruised, and strangely unreachable even to himself. He began writing shorter letters to Josie than he meant to, not because she mattered less, but because fame devoured language. Public speech drains private speech when a person isn't careful. Her replies remained practical and unadorned, full of Marcus, weather, rising prices, church gossip, and a few lines sharp enough to open his chest. She belonged to the shrinking category of people who still addressed him rather than the story around him. One Christmas, Marcus asked, "What does it feel like when everybody knows you?" Phil looked at the tree lights reflecting in the window. "Sometimes warm," he said. "Sometimes like standing outside your own front door." The country was turning him into a house admired from the road. Large, impressive, useful for collective fantasy. But houses seen only from outside accumulate myths, not intimacy. That realization deepened his loneliness more than obscurity ever had. He had once thought being seen would solve something fundamental. Fame taught him that being seen selectively can intensify invisibility. Chapter 18. The Helmet and the Mask. The helmet became more than equipment, it became permission. Once the face mask came down and the chin strap tightened, the world narrowed to assignments, angles, breadth, and impact. The public self receded. The field required no confession, no emotional fluency, no family history, only execution. In that reduction, there was relief. But the relief had a price. Off the field, people increasingly preferred the helmeted version of him, the one who hit hard, spoke little, and looked untroubled by complexity. Slow-motion replays deepened that distortion. Television loved him most as a silhouette of force. The aesthetic of impact erased aftermath. In quieter moments, he suspected the mask existed long before football gave it physical form. The orphanage had required one kind of stoicism, war another, celebrity a third. The helmet simply offered a visible symbol for an old survival skill: compress the self into what the moment can tolerate. The older he got, the more tired he became of hauling that compression from room to room. One Monday morning after a punishing game, he sat in the training room while a team doctor tested his shoulder under fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The room smelled of tape, antiseptic, and stale ambition. "You're built for this," the doctor said casually. Built for this. The phrase landed with familiar violence. He had heard variations on it all his life. Built to carry, built to hit, built to endure. Rarely had anybody asked what else he might have been built for, if the world had not discovered use first. That evening he stood before the mirror holding the helmet at his side. Without it, his face looked older than the myth required. Sadder, too. He put the helmet on and watched the man disappear into utility. Then he took it off again. The gesture felt ceremonial, almost accusatory. The mask protected him on the field. Elsewhere, it risked erasing him. He began to suspect that survival in public life required not only performance, but deliberate acts of unveiling before trusted people. Josie had done that once with laughter and porch light. Others would do it differently. He was only beginning to understand how necessary that labor was. Chapter 19. Cracks in the Legend. Pain arrived gradually, then all at once. At first it was ordinary athlete pain. Bruises, tape, swollen fingers, knees that needed time before behaving like hinges in the morning. Then came the deeper warnings: headaches lingering too long, a shoulder clicking strangely, the lower back ache that made sleep a negotiation rather than a rest. The body that had won admiration began sending invoices. Fans noticed none of this immediately. Legends are granted a period during which damage must remain off stage. Phil still made the highlight hits, still crossed the screen with terrifying certainty. But inside the game, fractions changed. Recovery lengthened. Fear entered by subtler doors. During one off-season, he bought land outside Magnolia Bend, a farmhouse set back from the road, fields open enough to let silence gather properly, pines at the edges, the smell of warm dirt and cut grass everywhere in summer. The first time he stood there alone with wind moving over the field, something in his chest loosened. On the farm, he began doing modest tasks for no audience at all: splitting wood, mending a hinge, clearing brush after a storm, and found disproportionate peace in them. Sweat under open sky felt different from sweat beneath lights. One kind belonged to transaction. The other belonged to relationship, with a place that demanded no performance beyond presence. Josie visited once with Marcus, who by then had grown old enough to ask more questions, and old enough to hide some of them. They ate fried chicken on the porch steps, because the house still held more echo than furniture. Josie looked over the fields and said, "First place I've seen that looks big enough for you to rest in." He turned away so she would not see how hard the sentence hit. Rest, however, sharpened old ghosts. In quiet, memory grew teeth. War returned in storms. The unknown woman from homecoming returned in dreams. Sister Agnes aged. Josie remained a steady ache of possibility and limitation. Pain clarified relationships the way winter clarifies a tree's shape. One night he sat alone on the porch listening to frogs and distant traffic and realized he was no longer asking whether the legend would last. He was asking what might survive after it didn't. That question frightened him. It also felt like the beginning of an honest life. Chapter 20. The Photographer's Eye. Phil met Lena Reyes in Los Angeles at the height of his public brightness, when the city seemed made of heat, angles, and reflective surfaces, pretending to be sky. A magazine had arranged a photo shoot designed to present him as athlete, war hero, and cultural phenomenon all at once. Stylists adjusted collars, assistants moved lights, publicists used the word narrative too often. Lena stepped around a light stand, camera resting low against her chest, and said, "They're making you pose like a monument. I need something more human than that." He stared at her, then laughed despite himself. She worked with unusual quiet. Instead of barking instructions, she suggested, "Lower the chin, sit instead of stand, look through the window, let the hands rest naturally." More importantly, she explained what she saw. "That expression," she said once, lowering the camera, "the one right before you disappear behind the public face, stay there." No one had spoken about his visibility with such accuracy. Lena's apartment overlooked a street lined with jacaranda trees that dropped bruised purple blossoms each spring. The place smelled faintly of coffee, film chemicals, citrus lotion, and books. Contact sheets covered the table. Photography books were stacked beside novels full of pencil marks. Nothing in the apartment asked him to be larger than human. That alone made it sacred. With Lena, conversation moved easily between art and wound. She could talk about light on a face, and, in the next breath, ask what grief had taught him about posture. She was not interested in extraction. She was interested in correspondence. How the inner life shaped gesture, how silence altered a room, how memory took up residence in shoulders and hands. Phil, who had spent years being looked at, found himself astonished by the difference between attention and consumption. Lena studied him with reverence and restraint. She wanted no myth. She wanted arrangement, tension, truth. Their friendship deepened because she asked good questions. Not what was your biggest game, but what places smell like in your memory. Not what keeps you motivated, but when do you trust silence? Such questions bypassed the polished answers public life had trained into him. Love came not as spectacle but repetition, accurate seeing repeated often enough to feel like home. Around her, Los Angeles changed shape. He noticed jacaranda petals on sidewalks, ocean salt mixed with exhaust, late light flattening billboards into fake theology. She taught him that seeing is an ethical act, when done without hunger to possess. He had been turned into image by the world many times. With Lena, image became invitation instead of trap. Chapter 21. Lights, Camera, Giant. Hollywood discovered Phil the way it discovers many public men, by assuming charisma from one arena can be profitably translated into another. A former war correspondent turned producer saw him at an event, liked the biography, loved the silhouette, and began speaking about authenticity as if it were a commodity he could rent. At first, Phil resisted. Acting seemed suspiciously close to surrendering entirely to image. Football at least required actual strain. Film looked like a world where consequences might be painted on. Lena surprised him. "Performance doesn't have to be fake," she said. "Sometimes it's disciplined attention." His first set smelled of sawdust, hot lights, makeup, stale coffee, and electrical heat. A fake alley had been built indoors, complete with trash, wet pavement, and moonlight generated by equipment. Film sets fascinated him because they made visible what other public systems concealed: how many people it takes to manufacture a single illusion. Carpenters built walls leading nowhere. Prop men aged objects overnight. Actors delivered heartbreak, then asked for sandwiches between takes. Phil was not instantly good. He was stiff in some scenes, overly careful in others. But directors liked what happened when he stopped trying to act like actors and simply stood in the truth of a moment. Audiences responded. Soon came action roles, then lighter parts that played with his gentleness. The myth expanded again, only now in color and on screens beyond football's reach. Lena remained his ballast. She visited sets, took still photographs, and laughed at the inflated seriousness of producers treating every trailer like theology. At night, after premieres and interviews, she asked what had felt false and what had felt earned. Those questions kept him from drifting too far into spectacle. Still, The danger was obvious. Hollywood wanted to recast him as the outside of himself over and over. Action figure, gentle giant, war-touched hero. Every role flattered and reduced simultaneously. One night after a premiere, flashbulbs still ghosting in his vision, he told Lena, "Feels like I keep getting recast as the part of me folks can explain." She slid her hand into his. "Then build a life where explanation don't get final say." He carried that sentence the way he once carried Coach Mercer's and Sister Agnes's. Through every camera setup, every red carpet, every manufactured moment of spontaneous charm, he kept feeling around for the difference between expression and packaging. The world kept offering him larger stages. Lena kept reminding him that scale and truth were not the same thing. Chapter 22. Buying the Quiet. Retirement came in increments rather than announcement. One more ache that lingered. One more conversation with younger men whose confidence smelled like replacement. One more morning when getting out of bed required negotiation between pride and cartilage. Phil stepped away from football first, then films more gradually, until public life loosened enough for silence to become audible again. He returned to the farmhouse with Lena and discovered that chosen quiet sounds different from loneliness. The house settled around them slowly. Furniture arrived, books accumulated, photographs leaned against walls before being hung, dishes clinked into cupboards. Domestic life did not diminish him, it gave him scale. The farmhouse acquired rituals that re-educated him in ordinary time. Morning coffee on the porch before the heat thickened. Lena, sorting negatives while sun moved across the floorboards. Supper made from whatever the garden and town could provide. Evenings when neither of them said much because the cicadas were enough company. After years of schedules set by leagues, studios, and itineraries, repetition felt not confining but medicinal. The land did its own work on him too. Pine pollen gathered on the porch. Evening brought the smell of cooling dirt and cut grass. Some mornings he walked the fields before sunrise with coffee warming both hands and felt his body belong to time rather than to demand. Stillness, however, does not erase memory, it sharpens it. With fewer distractions, old ghosts approached more clearly. The woman from homecoming returned. War returned in storms. Josie's porch reappeared in late summer twilight. Buying the Quiet had not purchased forgetting. It had only made room for what noise had once covered. One night, lightning flashed far off beyond the tree line, while Lena leaned against him on the porch. "You ever miss being seen?" she asked. He thought for a while. "Sometimes I miss knowing what part I'm supposed to play." And now? Now I'm trying to see who stays when there's no audience. The Quiet did not answer immediately. It simply held the question. That patience felt holier than applause ever had. Chapter 23. Father in a Giant's Body. Fatherhood changed the use of his hands first. That was the revelation. Hands that had blocked, struck, signed, and carried now learned to fasten tiny buttons, support wobbling heads, and cradle feverish weight without waking it fully. Strength took on a different grammar. The child he had with Lena arrived long-limbed, bright-eyed, and immediate in the way of children who seemed to enter a room already listening. Phil was terrified in the delivery room in ways football and war had never managed. Sudden love without strategy is more frightening than danger, because danger at least offers tasks. When the nurse placed the baby in his arms, some old wound in him answered with new knowledge. He had entered the world left on a stoop, unnamed by those who made him. Holding his own child, he understood with painful clarity both the sacredness and catastrophe of relinquishment. He took to walking the porch at night with the baby pressed against his chest, murmuring stories half-remembered, half-invented. Frogs called from the ditch. Owls stitched the dark with brief sounds. The child's hand would close around one finger and stay there with absolute trust. Trust that simple and total remade him. As the child grew, the questions came. Why do people stare at you? Were you really in a war? Why don't I know some of our family? Phil answered as truthfully as he could without handing a child burdens too raw to carry all at once. Fatherhood, he learned, is partly the moral art of editing pain into forms innocence can revisit later. Marcus visited from time to time, older now, carrying gratitude mixed with the complicated distance boys develop when the adults they love could not remain in one stable configuration. Phil cared for him steadily anyway. Love, he had learned too late to doubt, is not invalidated by impermanence. Lena once photographed him asleep in a chair with their child sprawled across his chest, sunlight across both faces. When he saw the print later, he had to sit down. The image revealed something he had spent years hoping was true, that his body, so often interpreted as threat, labor, or spectacle, could read unmistakably as safety. Fatherhood did not erase damage, it reordered it. The giant body that had once been used by town, army, league, and camera now housed a tenderness too ordinary for headlines and too important to need them. Chapter 24. Learning to read himself. Lena's illness arrived with the cruelty of gradualness. At first it was fatigue, then appointments, then doctors speaking carefully around probabilities they did not control. The farmhouse filled with pill bottles, quiet routines, and the strange stillness couples develop when love is being forced to become practical under pressure. After she died, the house changed temperature. Sound behaved differently. Sunlight seemed indecent in certain rooms. Grief made concentration slippery. Some days a single page of anything exhausted Phil, because every sentence seemed to ask whether language could hold the dead without cheapening them. It was Sister Agnes, old and nearly bent in on herself by then, who suggested he meet Ruthie Mae, a literacy teacher at the church. Phil had learned enough over the years to function, but reading had always remained partly labor and partly embarrassment. Now, in grief, it became something else, a possible path toward staying alive inside his own mind. Ruthie Mae taught in a side room off the church hall where a fan clicked overhead and late light turned the floorboards amber. Her voice was calm without softness, patient without pity. "Take your time, Phil," she said the first day when he stumbled over a passage. "Words ain't running away." That sentence embarrassed and relieved him all at once. Much of his life had been spent hurrying to meet other people's expectations of capability. Ruthie Mae made slowness feel like method rather than failure. Grief remained in the room with them. She did not treat reading as escape from sorrow. She treated it as a way to stand inside sorrow with more structure. When he faltered, she guided him back to the sentence, then from the sentence back into whatever memory it touched. In that movement, books became less things to master than companions in endurance. One rainy evening, with thunder rolling somewhere beyond Magnolia Bend and hymnals smelling faintly of damp paper, he read a paragraph aloud, cleanly from start to finish. Ruthie Mae smiled, not broadly, just enough. "There you are," she said. The words landed deeply. "Not there you improved, not there you tried hard. There you are." As if literacy were less about skill than self-recognition. He began borrowing books, underlining words, copying out passages simply to feel how rhythm worked under his own hand. Language became mirror, tool, and doorway all at once. Through reading, he began approaching a self larger than public summary and more delicate than his myths allowed. In learning to read more fully, Phil began, slowly, awkwardly, necessarily, to read himself. Chapter 25. The Giant at the Desk. Writing began as exercise and became sanctuary. Ruthie Mae suggested journaling to strengthen fluency, But once Phil started setting memory on paper, the work deepened beyond instruction. The desk in the farmhouse study gathered legal pads, sharpened pencils, coffee rings, drafts, and pages where whole sections of his life began standing beside one another for the first time. At first he wrote facts, dates, places, orphanage, stadium, Vietnam, Josie, Lena, homecoming, but facts alone felt skeletal. They resembled the public versions of him, correct and insufficient. So he began adding what the body remembered: the smell of magnolia rot, the sting of red dust in the throat, the metallic tang of fear before gunfire, the weight of a child fallen asleep on his chest. Some nights the writing moved so steadily that he looked up and found the room gone dark around the lamp. Other nights one sentence held him for an hour because he could feel when a phrase leaned toward performance instead of truth. Ruthie Mae taught him to distrust any passage that admired itself too much. "Say it plain first," she advised. "Beauty can come after honesty. It can't replace it." That rule changed more than his prose. Ruthie Mae read the pages only when invited, and when she praised something she praised precision, not effort. "Here's where the man catches up to the legend," she said once, tapping a line. Another time, "That's the first place you stopped hiding from the sentence." Her faith in the work felt trustworthy because it was rigorous. Love grew quietly in that room and around it. She would sit near the window marking passages while he wrote. Later she would rest her head against his chest on the couch and listen to the old, heavy heartbeat with an intimacy that made him feel known rather than inspected. In time they married, not as spectacle, but as the natural consequence of attention turned faithful. Their child, tall and quick-eyed, brought another layer of life into the farmhouse. Toys mixed with books, drafts shared space with school papers. The desk remained sacred, but never isolated from ordinary love. That saved the manuscript from becoming another mask. At the desk, the giant was not athlete, soldier, or symbol first. He was witness, and witnessing his own life with enough honesty to make it hold together may have been the bravest labor he ever accepted. Chapter 26. Two Phils. For years, Phil had lived as if divided by an invisible seam. There was the outer Phil, large, competent, useful, publicly legible. Then the inner Phil, watchful, wounded, tender, suspicious of applause, and uncertain whether being fully known might prove dangerous. Survival had depended on keeping those selves adjacent but separate. Ruthie Mae made separation harder to maintain. She noticed the shifts before he named them: strangers at the house, old teammates, interview requests, public events. Each could call forth the polished, formal version of him. His shoulders would square, his voice would flatten. He became careful, courteous, and farther away. Later, when quiet returned, she would sit nearby and wait, not to pry, to accompany. Eventually the other self returned, the one capable of humor, grief, uncertainty, and confession. "You act like it's dangerous to be loved all the way through," she told him once. He kept looking out at the field. "Might be. Hiding ain't exactly safe either." There were setbacks. Old habits do not surrender because they are named. After public appearances, he sometimes came home brittle and remote, needing hours before ordinary conversation felt possible. Ruthie Mae learned not to take that distance as rejection. Phil learned to signal it before it hardened. "Still coming back," he would say. The phrase became a quiet ritual between them, a marital acknowledgement that intimacy sometimes requires re-entry, not merely presence. Their child forced integration in another way. Children care less for curated identities than for availability. They interrupt melancholy with practical need. They ask who you are at breakfast, not in theory but in tone. Being father and husband daily pulled the outer and inner selves into collaboration. Strength had to coexist with softness, privacy with openness, silence with language. One winter night, with dishes drying in the kitchen and the house lit by one warm lamp, Ruthie Mae stood behind him at the window. "What do you see?" she asked. He looked at the reflection, broad frame, tired face, her beside him, the room holding both. "Less split than before," he said. That was no small thing. Integration did not come by miracle, triumph, or public acclaim. It came domestically, through repetition, honesty, grief, and the patient refusal of someone who loved him enough to insist his inside deserved as much reality as the legend outside. Chapter 27. Names and Bloodlines. The truth came late, and for that reason it came with more force than perhaps it would have earlier. Sister Agnes, thin and sharp-eyed in her final years, asked Phil to visit her in the church infirmary on a gray afternoon smelling of lavender, starch, and impending rain. "There are things withheld in the name of protection," she said once he sat. "Sometimes protection ages into harm." Then she told him what she knew. The woman's name, the pressure around her, the old man by the fence, the network of family silence and shame that had made abandonment easier than explanation. Not every detail, but enough to turn origin from abstraction into map. Phil sat still while rage and grief rose together. The old heat in him finally had object. The man outside the fence had not merely frightened him. He belonged to the story written in Phil's blood before he knew the alphabet for it. That evening he told Ruthie Mae in fragments, while rain moved over the roof. "She stood right there at homecoming," he said. "All that time." "Late truth still cuts," Ruthie Mae answered. She did not cheapen the moment with premature forgiveness. The meeting with his mother happened later in a borrowed living room, with a clicking floor fan and sweet tea sweating rings into coasters. Neither of them noticed. Restoration was not possible, and both seemed to know that immediately. She told him what fear had sounded like inside her family. Not excuses exactly. Weather, the kind people mistake for destiny when they have lived inside it too long. Phil listened with his jaw tight enough to ache. Anger remained, yet beneath it came another unbearable recognition. She had been younger, weaker, and more trapped than he had allowed himself to imagine. Compassion entered not as surrender, but as complication. In the days after, he walked his fields until his boots darkened with wet clay. He thought about names, the one given by nuns, the ones given by crowds, the names hidden under family shame. Bloodline, he realized, is often treated like fate by people who need excuses for repeating themselves. But blood can carry history without being granted command. The knowledge did not free him instantly. Truth rarely does. But it changed the direction of the struggle. He no longer fought shadows. He fought inheritance in daylight. Chapter 28. What Phil Carries. Ruthie Mae's illness announced itself the way winter does in certain climates, subtly at first, then with decisive rearrangement. Fatigue, a cough, a doctor's careful face, the farmhouse filled with schedules, medicines, and the knowledge that love was about to become labor of the holiest and most helpless kind. Phil had carried many things in his life: feed sacks, men from battle, expectations from crowds, sleeping children, grief like weather. None of it fully prepared him for caring for Ruthie Mae as her strength thinned. Hospitals returned him to rooms he disliked instinctively. Fluorescent light, antiseptic, overworked kindness, the bureaucratic choreography of pain. Yet he learned details with devotion: which blanket she preferred, how to lift her without causing pain, which food still sounded possible, which jokes remained funny when fear had become furniture in the room. During the worst weeks, sleep came in fragments. He would doze in a chair beside the bed, Wake to a change in her breathing. Check the clock. Feel the cold hush before dawn settle over the house. Grief began there, before death, in the repeated recognition that love cannot negotiate a body back into permanence. Their child moved through the season with brave confusion. No one in the house was spared, yet all were altered differently. Phil spoke more plainly than he ever had before, because concealment now felt wasteful. Tenderness required clarity, while there was time to offer it. One winter afternoon, while pale sunlight lay across the bedroom floorboards, Ruthie Mae asked him to read from the manuscript. His voice caught twice, then steadied. He read about Magnolia Bend, about football, about Lena, about Marcus, about the old questions and the newer mercies. When he finished, she touched the stack of pages lightly. "You finally sound like yourself," she said. That sentence undid him more deeply than diagnosis had, not because it promised recovery, because it confirmed the work of becoming had mattered. Even in the hardest days, beauty persisted stubbornly, a bird calling at first light, warm towels from the dryer, the brief look of relief on Ruthie Mae's face when pain ebbed for an hour. Such moments did not erase suffering. They made it bearable enough to accompany. After she died, the house altered instantly. Sound traveled differently. Rooms expanded around absence. Phil moved from desk to porch to kitchen, touching familiar objects as though contact might keep the world from drifting too far. What he carried then could not be measured in shoulders or arms. It lived in memory, duty, tenderness, and the ache of having been fully known by someone whose absence remained vividly inhabited. Chapter 29. Inside the Giant. After Ruthie Mae's death, the manuscript became burden and mercy at once. Phil returned to the desk because grief needed form and because she had asked, in every way short of command, that he continue. Outside, the seasons moved with indecent reliability. Pollen came, storms came, the fields greened and browned and greened again. Inside, pages gathered. He wrote not to justify himself, but to resist simplification. Every page argued with the flattened versions of him. Public life had circulated for decades. Here was the child who mistook usefulness for worth. Here was the soldier frightened by his own efficiency. Here was the lover discovering tenderness demanded as much courage as impact. Here was the husband and father learning that staying could be holier than triumph. Some days the work undid him. A memory of Sister Agnes saving him the last biscuit might stop him for an hour. Writing the ambush brought back the smell of smoke so sharply he had to leave the room. The chapter about his mother required the most patience, because anger and pity refused clean separation. Eventually he visited her grave. She had died before all possible conversations could occur, which seemed fitting in the saddest way. Magnolia Bend had changed and not changed. New paint in a few places, same river smell after rain, same church bell dividing the day into obligations. The cemetery held late summer heat. Cicadas pulsed in the trees. Dry grass clicked under his boots. He stood there a long time before speaking. "I carried this a long way," he said aloud. "I ain't carrying it the same anymore." The words were plain. Plainness had become a form of truth to him. Forgiveness, he had learned, was not denial. It was the refusal to let harm remain the final editor of the story. Back at the farmhouse, he finished the manuscript where Ruthie Mae had once stood smiling in the doorway. He wrote the final sentence and sat with both hands folded, not triumphant, simply emptied in a clean way. The house hummed softly. Evening pressed gold against the windows. Inside the Giant, there had always been more than size, force, and legend. There had been a boy wanting to be known without being used, a man wanting to love without disappearing, and a soul wanting language large enough to hold violence and grace in the same body. The manuscript did not cure him. It witnessed him. Sometimes witness is the closest thing to peace a life can earn. Chapter 30. A Different Kind of Legend. Years later, on an evening washed in peach-colored dusk, Phil sat on the farmhouse porch while the fields exhaled the day's last heat. The boards beneath his chair had worn to the shape of habit. Crickets began their patient music in the grass. Somewhere off near the road, a dog barked twice and gave up on making the night answer. His child, grown now, tall like him and brighter in ways that made old pain feel transformed instead of repeated, came out carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. They sat without speaking at first. The best relationships in Phil's life had taught him silence could be language when no one was using it to hide. Wind moved over the field in dark ripples. The screen door tapped softly inside. Honeysuckle and cut hay mingled in the thickening air. Phil looked out over the land he had once bought for quiet and understood at last that quiet had given him far more than rest. It had given him proportion. "I read the pages again," his child said after a while. "Oh, yeah?" A smile. "Yeah, I appreciate you, Dad, for the land, the stories, the love, for staying." For staying. No medal, headline, contract, or chant had ever named him more accurately. The world had praised what he could do under pressure. This thanked him for presence. He felt suddenly the entire distance between the child left on the orphanage stoop and the man on this porch being known by someone he had not failed to remain for. Not perfectly, not without damage, but truly. He no longer needed history to vindicate him. That was perhaps the final change. Once he had wanted his life to mean something large enough to justify its pain. Age taught him that meaning did not always arrive as grandeur. Sometimes it arrived as continuity. The fact that tenderness had outlived violence, that truth had outlived mythology, that a child once left without explanation had become the sort of father whose staying could be named and trusted. Stars appeared over the fields one by one. Phil rested his hands on his knees and let the moment remain ordinary. The world had spent decades turning him into symbols, useful for its own hunger. This was different. This was not symbol. This was inheritance repaired, as far as any life can repair it. He thought of Sister Agnes, Coach Mercer, Terrence, Josie, Marcus, Lena, Ruthie Mae, his mother, the old man at the fence, the cheering crowds, the jungle, the camera, the desk. None of them could be reduced to lesson without doing violence to truth. Together, they had shaped a man less split than before, less owned by old anger, more faithful to the tenderness life had demanded from him. When his child bumped his shoulder lightly, Phil smiled into the dark. The giant and the man were no longer rivals for the same body. They had become one inheritance at last. Strength made human by love, solitude made fruitful by witness, legend made honest by the quiet courage of staying. The end. Thank you for spending this time inside the world of this book and for walking with these characters all the way to the end. Your attention, your imagination, and your willingness to go on this journey are what makes stories like this truly live. On behalf of the author, Ben Solomon, and everyone at VL Underground and VL Creative Studios, thank you for reading, listening, and supporting independent storytelling. There is much more to come. New books, new films, new documentaries, and new worlds to explore. So stay tuned for future projects from Ben Solomon and VL Underground and VL Creative. Until then, thank you again for being part of this story and for continuing to travel with us into whatever comes next.